Have you ever wondered what desperation truly looks like? What happens when a mother's love collides with the unforgiving cruelty of survival? In the winter of 1881, in a forgotten corner of the Appalachian Mountains, a story unfolded that would haunt the hills for generations. This is not a tale of monsters or ghosts. This is about something far more terrifying. What human beings become when hunger strips away everything but the will to live. A widow, a child, and a secret so dark that even the frozen ground couldn't keep it buried. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the limits of human endurance. Widow's Peak was never meant to be a town. It was a collection of desperate souls clinging to the side of a mountain, barely surviving in wooden shacks that groaned against the winter winds. The settlement got its name from the sharp ridge that overlooked the valley, a jagged point of rock that resembled a mourning veil. By 1881, more than half the women there had lost their husbands to mining accidents, logging mishaps, or the simple cruelty of a land that took more than it gave. Eleanor Pritchard was one of those widows. At 32 years old, she looked 50. Her husband, James, had died 3 years earlier when a rotted beam collapsed in the coal mine 5 miles down the mountain. The company paid her $17 for a man's life, for 3 years of back-breaking labor in the dark. She took the money without a word, her face as grey as the ash that perpetually dusted the town. Eleanor lived with her daughter May in a cabin at the edge of the settlement. May was 8 years old, small for her age, with blonde hair that had gone dull from malnutrition and eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main space with a fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs, and a smaller room where they slept on a single straw mattress. The walls were chinked with mud and moss, but the winter wind still found its way through, turning their breath to fog even indoors. The winter of 1881 came early and stayed late. By November, snow had already buried the paths between cabins. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in its bucket overnight. Eleanor had managed to put away some dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, and half a smoked ham from the previous fall. She rationed it carefully, measuring every spoonful, every slice. She knew it wouldn't be enough, it never was. May didn't complain. Children in Widow's Peak learned early not to ask for what couldn't be given. She spent her days huddled by the fire, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned, watching her mother's hands shake as she stirred watery soup in the iron pot. Eleanor took work where she could find it, washing clothes for the few families who still had money, mending torn shirts and pants by candlelight until her eyes burned. But work was scarce. Everyone was struggling. By mid-December, the food was nearly gone. Eleanor boiled the ham bone 3 times, trying to extract every trace of flavor and nutrition. She made soup from snow and the last handful of cornmeal, adding bits of tree bark she'd read somewhere were edible. May ate without question, her stomach too empty to care about taste. Eleanor watched her daughter grow thinner, the bones of her wrists protruding like twigs, her cheeks hollow. At night, May's breathing was shallow and labored. Eleanor stopped eating. She told May the soup upset her stomach, that she'd eaten earlier, that she wasn't hungry. All lies. She gave her portions to her daughter, watching May swallow every spoonful with the desperation of someone who knew it might be the last. Eleanor's own body began to fail. Her vision blurred, her hands trembled constantly. When she stood too quickly, the world tilted and darkened at the edges. On December 20th, Eleanor walked to the settlement's small general store. The owner, Thomas Garrett, was a hard man with a harder heart. She asked if she could buy on credit. Just a little flour, some lard, anything. Thomas looked at her with the cold assessment of someone calculating risk. He shook his head. She had no collateral, no way to pay him back. He'd heard it all before from every widow in town. Eleanor left empty-handed, her pride shattered, her desperation complete. That night, as May slept fitfully beside her, Eleanor made a decision. She would walk to the next town 15 miles through the snow and beg for work. It was dangerous. The path was treacherous in winter, but staying meant watching her daughter starve. She had no choice. At dawn, she wrapped herself in every layer she owned, kissed May's forehead, and stepped into the frozen morning. The snow was waist-deep in places. The wind cut through her clothes like knives. But Eleanor Pritchard walked, because that's what mothers do. They endure the impossible for the ones they love. Eleanor didn't make it to the next town. 3 miles into her journey, her body gave out. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion formed a trinity of suffering that even her iron will couldn't overcome. She collapsed in a snowdrift beside a fallen pine tree, her vision fading, her limbs refusing to obey. For a moment she thought about May waking up alone, and the thought filled her with such terror that she tried to stand. Her legs buckled. She fell forward into the snow and the world went dark. She woke to voices. Rough hands lifted her, carried her. She tried to speak, but her throat was frozen shut. The voices belonged to 2 loggers who'd been checking their traps. They recognized her, knew she was from Widow's Peak. They brought her back to her cabin and laid her on the mattress beside May, who cried out and clutched her mother's frozen hands. The loggers built up the fire, left a small bundle of dried venison, and disappeared back into the woods. They'd done what they could. The rest was up to Eleanor. For 2 days, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. May fed her tiny pieces of the venison, warmed water for her to drink, and kept the fire burning with the last of their wood. The child had become the caretaker, her small hands doing the work of survival with a competence born of necessity. Eleanor's frostbitten fingers began to blacken. Fever set in. May pressed snow against her mother's burning forehead and whispered prayers she'd learned from a traveling preacher years ago. On the 3rd day, Eleanor's fever broke. She opened her eyes to find May asleep beside her, the child's face pressed against her shoulder. Eleanor's body ached with a pain so profound it felt like her bones were grinding together. But she was alive. She looked around the cabin. The venison was gone. The fire was dying. There was no more wood, no more food, nothing left but the 2 of them and the relentless cold. Eleanor knew then that she'd failed. She'd tried everything a person could try, and it wasn't enough. The world didn't care about effort. It didn't reward suffering with salvation. She looked at May's sleeping face and felt something break inside her. Not her will. Not her love. Something deeper. Something fundamental about what it meant to be human. In that moment, Eleanor understood that she was capable of anything. Absolutely anything. To save her daughter, there was no line she wouldn't cross. She forced herself to stand. Every movement was agony. Her frost-bitten fingers throbbed. Her legs shook. But she moved to the window and looked out at the settlement. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. Life continued, indifferent to her suffering. Her eyes moved to the small cemetery at the edge of town, a collection of wooden crosses half buried in snow, fresh graves from the winter, people who hadn't survived. And suddenly, a thought entered her mind. A terrible, unspeakable thought that should have horrified her. But it didn't, because horror is a luxury reserved for those who aren't starving. Eleanor had heard stories, whispers in the dark about what people did during the worst winters. Stories from older settlements, from wagon trains trapped in mountain passes, from ships lost at sea. Stories that were never spoken aloud in daylight, but everyone knew. Stories about survival at any cost. She'd always believed those stories were exaggerations, myths designed to frighten children or entertain bored men. But standing there, looking at those snow-covered graves, Eleanor realized the stories were true. They had to be, because the alternative was death. And human beings will do anything to avoid death. May stirred behind her, coughing weakly. The sound cut through Eleanor like a blade. Her daughter was dying, slowly, painfully, inevitably dying. And Eleanor had the power to stop it. All she had to do was abandon every moral principle she'd ever held. All she had to do was become something other than human. The choice should have been impossible. It should have been unthinkable. But when Eleanor turned from the window and looked at May's wasted body, at the bones pressing against translucent skin, at the life fading from those 2 large eyes, the choice became simple, horrifying, but simple. That night, Eleanor waited until May fell asleep. She wrapped herself in her thinnest shawl, took a small shovel from the corner, and stepped out into the darkness. The cemetery was 100 yards away, hidden behind a stand of bare trees. The moon was full, turning the snow into a field of silver. Eleanor's breath came in short gasps, not from exertion but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. She reached the cemetery and stood among the crosses, reading names by moonlight. She was looking for something specific, a fresh grave. Someone recently buried, someone whose body wouldn't yet be frozen solid. She found it at the edge of the cemetery, a small cross with a child's name carved roughly into the wood. Thomas Miller, age 6, died December 15th, 5 days ago. Eleanor knew the family. She'd washed their clothes once. The boy had died from fever, his small body unable to fight the infection that ravaged him. His parents had buried him quickly, as was the custom, before the ground froze completely. Eleanor stood over the grave, shovel in hand, and felt the last remnants of her humanity slip away into the winter night. The ground was harder than Eleanor expected. Even though the grave was recent, the frost had already begun its work, turning the top layer of soil into something between earth and stone. She drove the shovel down with all her remaining strength, feeling the impact jolt through her frost-bitten hands. Pain shot up her arms, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Each strike of the shovel was an act of desperation, of love twisted into something unrecognizable. She worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against frozen earth and her own ragged breathing. Sweat soaked through her clothes despite the cold, freezing against her skin. Her muscles screamed, her vision blurred, but she kept digging. Down through the frost layer, down through the softer earth beneath, down toward the unthinkable. The moon watched impassively, casting her shadow long across the snow. It took 2 hours to reach the body. Her shovel struck something solid but yielding, and Eleanor's stomach lurched. She dropped to her knees and cleared away the remaining dirt with her bare hands. The small wooden coffin appeared, rough pine boards nailed hastily together. Eleanor's hands shook as she pried at the lid with the shovel blade. The nails groaned, the wood splintered. And then it was open. Thomas Miller looked peaceful. Death had smoothed away the pain of his final days. His face was pale, almost translucent, his small hands folded across his chest. Someone had dressed him in his best clothes, a gesture of love from parents who had nothing else to give. Eleanor stared down at the child, and for a moment her resolve wavered. This was someone's son. Someone had loved him, held him, sung to him. Someone had buried him with tears and prayers, and the desperate hope that death was not the end. But then Eleanor thought of May, of her daughter's hollow cheeks and labored breathing, of the way May's ribs showed through her skin like the bars of a cage, of the light fading from her eyes a little more each day. Eleanor reached into the coffin. Her hands closed around the small cold body, and she lifted him out. The walk back to her cabin felt like a journey through hell. Eleanor carried the boy's body wrapped in her shawl, held against her chest like a sleeping child. Anyone who saw her would think she was carrying her daughter to safety. No one would suspect. No one could imagine. The settlement was silent, everyone asleep or huddled by their fires. Eleanor moved through the shadows, a ghost among ghosts, carrying death home to create life. Inside the cabin, May still slept. Eleanor laid the body on the table and stood over it, trembling. This was the moment, the point of no return. She could still stop. She could return the body to its grave, tell no one, and let nature take its course. She could die with her humanity intact. But May whimpered in her sleep, a small sound of pain and hunger, and Eleanor's hands moved without conscious thought. She had a knife. Every household had a knife. This one had belonged to her husband, used for butchering game when there was still game to butcher. The blade was dull but functional. Eleanor sharpened it on the whetstone with mechanical precision, the scrape of metal against stone loud in the silent cabin. Her mind was blank. She wasn't thinking, couldn't think. If she allowed herself to think, to truly comprehend what she was about to do, she would go mad. The process was clinical. Eleanor had butchered animals before, rabbits, chickens, once even a deer that James had brought home. She knew anatomy, knew how to separate meat from bone, how to identify what was edible and what wasn't. She worked by candlelight, her hands steady despite the horror of it. She cut away the clothing first. Then she began the butchering, treating the small body like any other meat, because the alternative was to acknowledge what it really was. It took an hour. When she was finished, there were cuts of meat wrapped in cloth on the table, bones set aside, organs buried in the snow outside. and the undeniable evidence of what she'd done. Eleanor stared at what she'd created, and something inside her died. Not her body, not her mind, her soul. Whatever part of a person separates them from animals, that part withered and blackened and fell away. She was no longer Eleanor Pritchard, widow and mother. She was something else, something without a name. She chose the smallest piece of meat and placed it in the iron pot with snow and a pinch of salt they'd been saving. The fire was nearly dead, but she coaxed it back to life with splinters from the table leg. The meat began to cook, releasing a smell that made her stomach clench with hunger and revulsion in equal measure. It smelled like any other meat, like survival, like sin. May woke to the smell. She sat up, confusion on her face, then hope. Her eyes found the pot, found her mother stirring something that steamed and promised warmth and sustenance. May's voice was small and cracked. She asked what it was, where it came from, and Eleanor lied. She said the loggers had come back, they'd left more venison, a gift for the sick widow and her daughter. May believed her because children believe their mothers, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. Eleanor fed her daughter small bites, watching each piece disappear into May's eager mouth. The child ate like she'd never tasted anything so good, her body responding to nutrition it had been denied for so long. Color returned to her cheeks. Her eyes brightened. She asked for more, and Eleanor gave it, feeling both relief and horror at the sight of her daughter's recovery. This was working. The abomination was working. May was going to survive, and Eleanor's damnation was complete. The meat lasted 5 days. 5 days during which May's condition improved dramatically. Her breathing steadied. Her skin regained some of its color. She had energy enough to sit up, to move around the cabin, to smile at her mother with genuine joy. Eleanor watched this transformation with a heart split between gratitude and self-loathing. She'd saved her daughter's life, and destroyed her own soul in the process. Eleanor couldn't eat. Every time she looked at the wrapped portions on the shelf, her stomach rebelled. She told May she was still sick, that her appetite hadn't returned. May accepted this explanation with the trusting nature of a child who'd never been given reason to doubt her mother. Eleanor subsisted on snow melted into water and the occasional scrap of tree bark boiled into a bitter tea. Her body continued to weaken, but her mind grew sharper, more focused on a single terrible question. What would she do when the meat ran out? The settlement remained locked in winter's grip. Snow fell almost daily, adding to the drifts that now reached the cabin windows. No one traveled. No one visited. The isolation was complete. Eleanor's secret was safe, but safety meant nothing if May started starving again, and the meat was running out. 2 days left, maybe 3 if she rationed carefully. Then they'd be back where they started, except now Eleanor knew exactly what she was capable of. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. On the 3rd day, May asked about the meat. Where had the loggers gotten venison in the middle of winter? Weren't the deer all sheltered in the valleys? Eleanor's heart raced as she invented another lie. The loggers had trapped it earlier, she said. They'd smoked it and saved it for emergencies. May nodded, satisfied, but something in her expression suggested doubt. Children aren't stupid. They sense when something is wrong even if they can't articulate what. Eleanor saw that doubt and felt a new kind of fear. Not fear of discovery, fear that May would somehow intuit the truth and be scarred by it forever. That night, Eleanor lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, the cold pressed in from all sides. And her mind turned over the impossible mathematics of survival. One child's body had bought them 5 days. The settlement had 6 recent graves. If she visited them all, if she did the unthinkable 6 more times, they might survive until spring. 30 days. 40 if she rationed carefully. Long enough for the snow to melt, for the passes to clear, for them to walk down the mountain to the valley settlements where there was food and work and life. The calculation was monstrous. It reduced human beings to measurements of meat and time. It turned the dead into resources. It made Eleanor into something she couldn't name because the language didn't have a word horrible enough. But the calculation was also survival. It was the difference between May living and May dying. And Eleanor had already crossed the line. She'd already damned herself. Going back wasn't an option. The only path was forward, deeper into the darkness. 2 days later, the meat was gone. May's improvement plateaued. She wasn't getting worse, but she wasn't getting better either. She needed more. Eleanor knew what she had to do. The knowledge sat in her chest like ice, cold and hard and undeniable. That night she took up the shovel again and returned to the cemetery. This time she chose a different grave, an older person, a man who died from a logging accident. Eleanor told herself it was different, not a child, a grown man who'd lived a full life. The justification was paper-thin, but she clung to it anyway because the alternative was admitting she'd become a monster. The second grave was easier than the first, not physically, but mentally. The horror had dulled. The moral weight had become familiar. Eleanor's hands moved with practiced efficiency, digging through frozen earth, prying open the coffin, extracting what she needed. She felt nothing, no revulsion, no guilt. Just the mechanical certainty of a predator securing food. She'd become something beyond humanity, operating on instinct and necessity alone. She processed the body in the cabin while May slept, working by dim candlelight, the knife moving with surgical precision. More meat for the shelf, more days bought with atrocity, more proof that love could transform into something unrecognizable. Eleanor wrapped the portions carefully, labeled them in her mind as different batches from the loggers, and stored them away. Then she burned the clothes and buried the bones in a snowbank behind the cabin. Evidence hidden. Conscience silenced. Survival secured. May woke the next morning to the smell of cooking meat and asked no questions. She ate gratefully, her body responding to the nutrition, her strength slowly returning. Eleanor watched her daughter eat and felt nothing. The part of her that could feel had been carved away piece by piece with every cut of the knife. She was hollow now, a shell performing the motions of motherhood while the person inside had long since died. The pattern repeated. Every few days, when the meat ran low, Eleanor returned to the cemetery. She chose different graves, different bodies. She told herself stories to make it bearable. This one had been a drunk who beat his wife. That one had been cruel to children. The stories were probably lies, but they helped Eleanor maintain the illusion that she was making choices, exercising judgment, operating under some kind of moral framework, however twisted. The truth was simpler and more terrible. She was keeping her daughter alive, and she would kill the whole world if necessary to continue doing so. By January's end, Eleanor had visited 4 graves. May's health had stabilized. The child had regained much of her lost weight. Her eyes were bright again, her laughter returned. To anyone who might have visited, it would have looked like a miracle. The widow and her daughter surviving the harshest winter in memory, while others starved. A testament to faith, to resilience, to divine providence. Only Eleanor knew the truth. Only Eleanor carried the weight of what they were truly eating. And only Eleanor understood that she would carry that knowledge alone forever. Because telling anyone would destroy the one thing she'd sacrificed everything to save, her daughter's life, her daughter's innocence, her daughter's future. Even if Eleanor's own future was nothing but darkness and damnation, May would survive. And sometimes survival is all that matters. February brought a brief thaw. For 3 days, the temperature rose just enough to melt the top layer of snow, turning the settlement into a maze of slush and mud. Eleanor stood at her window, watching water drip from the cabin's roof, listening to the sound of melting ice, and felt something close to hope. Spring was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. They just had to survive a little longer. May had grown strong enough to help with small tasks around the cabin. She swept the floor, organized their meager possessions, and even ventured outside to gather icicles for water. Eleanor watched her daughter move with energy that had been absent for months, and felt the weight of her crimes press harder against her chest. May was alive because of what Eleanor had done. But what kind of life would it be if May ever learned the truth? The thaw ended on the 4th day. Temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the slush into treacherous sheets of ice. The settlement became even more isolated, people afraid to venture out on paths that could break ankles or worse. Eleanor's meat supply was running low again. 2 portions left. Maybe 3 days if she stretched them. The cemetery called to her, but something had changed. The graves she'd already visited were obvious now, the disturbed snow and refilled earth visible even under fresh powder. Someone might notice, someone might investigate. Eleanor began watching the settlement more carefully, looking for alternatives, observing patterns. She noticed that old Martha Hendricks, who lived 2 cabins down, hadn't shown smoke from her chimney in 3 days. Eleanor walked over one morning, knocked, received no answer. The door was unlocked. Inside, Martha lay in her bed, dead from cold and age and the simple exhaustion of trying to survive another winter. She'd been dead perhaps 2 days, the cold preserving her body. Eleanor stood over Martha's corpse and felt the familiar calculation begin. No one knew Martha was dead yet. No one would check for days, maybe weeks. The body was already in a structure, no need to dig through frozen ground. It would be easier, cleaner, more efficient. Eleanor's hands moved before her mind fully processed the decision. She wrapped Martha's body in the woman's own blankets and dragged it through the back door, across the snow, to her own cabin. May was sleeping. She never knew what her mother brought home that afternoon. The processing was routine now. Eleanor's hands moved with mechanical precision, her mind blank, her emotions buried so deep they might never resurface. More meat for the shelf, more days of survival bought with someone else's death. Martha had been 73 years old. She'd lived a long life. She'd died naturally. Eleanor told herself these things as justification, knowing they were meaningless, knowing she'd moved beyond justification into something darker and more primal. May ate the new portions without question. The meat from the loggers, she believed. More gifts from generous strangers. Eleanor maintained the lie because the truth would shatter her daughter's mind. Better May believe in kindness than know she'd been kept alive by horror. Better she grow up whole and healthy, even if built on a foundation of atrocity, than grow up damaged by knowledge too terrible for a child to carry. But Eleanor was changing. The act of deception, of maintaining normalcy while committing unspeakable acts, was fragmenting her sense of self. She caught herself staring at May sometimes, not with love but with cold assessment, calculating how many days the child's improving health had bought them, wondering what she'd do if May got sick again, if the meat ran out, if winter never ended. Dark thoughts that should have horrified her, but instead felt practical, logical, necessary. One night, May woke screaming from a nightmare. Eleanor rushed to her daughter's side, held her, whispered comfort. May clung to her mother and sobbed about a dream where she was eating something terrible, something wrong. And when she looked down, it wasn't food at all, but something that stared back at her with human eyes. Eleanor's blood froze. She assured May it was just a dream, just winter madness, just the fever playing tricks. But she wondered if some part of May knew, if some deep animal part of her daughter's brain had sensed the truth and tried to warn her through dreams. The next morning, Eleanor noticed something else. May had stopped asking about the loggers, stopped asking where the meat came from. She ate silently now, her face expressionless, her eyes distant. Eleanor tried to convince herself it was just fatigue, just the lingering effects of malnutrition. But she knew better. She knew that children sense things adults try to hide, and she knew that May's silence was more terrible than any accusation could ever be. Because silence meant May had learned not to ask questions, had learned that some truths are too dangerous to pursue, had learned, at 8 years old, that survival sometimes requires willful blindness, and that lesson, Eleanor realized, might be the worst thing she'd done to her daughter yet. March arrived with no sign that winter would ever end. The snow continued, relentless and suffocating. Eleanor's latest acquisition from Martha's death was nearly depleted. She stood at her window during the grey afternoon light, watching the settlement, and realized with cold certainty that she was being watched in return. Thomas Garrett, the store owner, stood outside his shop staring directly at her cabin. He'd been doing that more frequently. Others too. Suspicious glances, whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Eleanor's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone noticed the disturbed graves? Had Martha's disappearance raised questions? The old woman had no family, no close friends, but her absence would eventually be noted. And Eleanor had made a mistake. She'd taken Martha from her cabin instead of making it look like the woman had simply died in her sleep. The empty house would raise questions, questions that might lead to Eleanor's door. That evening, there was a knock. Eleanor's heart seized. May looked up from the fire, confused. They never had visitors. Eleanor opened the door to find Sarah Mitchell, one of the other widows, standing in the snow with a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Sarah's face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She looked like she was dying. She probably was. Sarah asked if Eleanor had any food to spare. Anything at all. Her children were starving. Eleanor stood in the doorway, blocking Sarah's view of the interior, and said no, they had nothing. They were barely surviving themselves. Sarah's eyes moved past Eleanor, searching the cabin, and landed on May, sitting by the fire. The child looked healthy, too healthy. Sarah's expression shifted from desperation to suspicion. She asked again, her voice harder. Where was Eleanor getting food? How was her daughter thriving when everyone else was dying? What was she hiding? Eleanor closed the door in Sarah's face. She stood with her back against the wood, heart pounding, mind calculating. Sarah would talk. She'd tell others what she'd seen. The questions would multiply. People would start investigating. They'd find the disturbed graves. They'd find Martha's empty cabin. They'd piece together a story that, while perhaps not the exact truth, would be close enough. Eleanor had perhaps 2 days before her secret unraveled completely. She turned to find May staring at her. The child's expression was unreadable. She asked who that woman was, why she seemed angry. Eleanor said it was nothing. Just a neighbor asking for help they couldn't provide. But May's eyes held something new. Knowledge, understanding, fear. Eleanor realized with sickening certainty that May had heard the accusation in Sarah's voice, had sensed the danger, and was starting to put pieces together in her young mind. That night Eleanor lay awake planning. She could leave. Take May and flee down the mountain before dawn. Risk the journey to the valley settlements despite the danger. But where would they go? What would they say? How would she explain their sudden departure, their relative health, their survival when so many had died? Every path led to questions. Questions led to investigations. Investigations led to the truth. And the truth meant death. Not just for Eleanor, but for May too. The daughter of a monster, a child tainted by association with unspeakable crimes. The alternative was equally terrible. Stay and wait for discovery. Prepare some kind of defense. Claim ignorance. Blame the grave's disturbance on animals. Explain Martha's disappearance as the woman finally fleeing to stay with distant relatives. The lies would be transparent. No one would believe them. But perhaps Eleanor could buy enough time for May to distance herself, to claim she knew nothing, to be seen as a victim rather than an accomplice. Morning brought more visitors, 3 men this time. Thomas Garrett and 2 others Eleanor recognized as members of the settlement's informal council. They didn't knock. They pushed open the door and entered without invitation, their faces hard, their intentions clear. Thomas demanded to know where Eleanor was getting food. The other men moved through the cabin, opening cabinets, checking shelves, looking for evidence. May pressed herself into the corner, terrified. Eleanor stood her ground. She said they had nothing, showed them the nearly empty shelves, explained that May's improvement was due to careful rationing and the small amounts of food given by the loggers weeks ago. The men weren't convinced. One of them, Jacob Ross, pointed at the shelf where Eleanor kept her wrapped portions. He asked what was in the cloth bundles. Eleanor's mind went blank. She couldn't think of a lie fast enough. Couldn't think of anything except the horrible truth wrapped in those innocent-looking packages. Thomas reached for one of the bundles. Eleanor moved to stop him, but Jacob grabbed her arm, holding her back. Thomas unwrapped the cloth and stared at the contents. His face went pale. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that combined horror, disgust, and sudden, terrible understanding. He asked where she got the meat, what animal it came from, why it looked so strange, so unlike any game he'd ever seen. Eleanor said nothing. Her silence was answer enough. Thomas dropped the bundle like it had burned him. The meat fell to the floor, undeniably human in appearance now that it was examined closely. The men backed toward the door, their faces reflecting the dawning comprehension of what they'd discovered. One of them cursed, another made the sign of the cross, and Thomas, his voice shaking, told Eleanor to stay in her cabin. They would return with others. They would decide what to do. But Eleanor already knew what they'd decide. There was only one punishment for what she'd done. The men left, but Eleanor knew they'd return. She had perhaps an hour before the entire settlement descended on her cabin, with torches and rope and righteous fury. She turned to May and saw her daughter staring at the meat on the floor, her face blank with shock. The child's lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't bring herself to speak. Eleanor knelt before her, took her small hands, and prepared to explain the unexplainable. But May spoke first. Her voice was small and trembling, but the words were clear. She asked if that was what they'd been eating, if that was where the meat from the loggers came from, if her mother had been lying all along. Eleanor wanted to lie again, to protect May from the truth for just a few moments longer, but the child's eyes held such pain and betrayal that Eleanor found herself nodding. Yes, she'd lied. The loggers had never brought meat. Everything May had eaten, everything that had saved her life, had come from sources too terrible to name. May pulled her hands away and stumbled backward. She looked at her mother, like Eleanor was a stranger, something monstrous wearing a familiar face. Eleanor tried to explain, tried to make May understand that everything she'd done was for her, to save her, to keep her alive. But the words sounded hollow, even to Eleanor's own ears. Love wasn't justification for horror. Intention didn't erase action. She'd committed atrocities and fed them to her daughter, and no amount of maternal devotion could make that acceptable. May ran to the corner and vomited. Her small body heaved, trying to expel the abomination she'd unknowingly consumed. But it was too late. The meat had already been digested, already become part of her, already transformed into the blood and muscle and bone that kept her alive. May would carry this inside her forever, literally and figuratively. Eleanor had saved her daughter's body but destroyed her soul in the process. Outside, voices rose, angry voices, frightened voices. The settlement was gathering. Eleanor moved to the window and saw torches being lit, makeshift weapons being gathered. She saw Sarah Mitchell pointing at the cabin, her face twisted with vindication. Saw Thomas Garrett organizing the men into a mob. Saw the collective rage of a community that had suffered all winter, finding focus in one target. They were coming for her. Eleanor turned back to May. She had minutes, maybe less. She knelt before her daughter again and spoke quickly, urgently. She told May that what was about to happen wasn't the child's fault, that May had done nothing wrong, that everything, every terrible thing was Eleanor's choice and Eleanor's burden. She made May promise to tell them she didn't know, to claim ignorance, to say her mother had lied to her, had hidden everything, had kept her in darkness. It was the only way May might survive what came next. May didn't respond. She stared at the floor, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking. Eleanor pulled her daughter close despite May's resistance. She held the child tight and whispered apologies that meant nothing and changed nothing. She told May she loved her, that everything she'd done, however horrible, came from love, that if she could go back and choose differently, she wasn't sure she would, because the alternative was watching May die. And Eleanor couldn't have survived that. Better to be a monster than a grieving mother. The door burst open. Men flooded into the cabin, grabbing Eleanor, tearing her away from May. Eleanor didn't resist. There was no point. They dragged her outside into the snow where the crowd had gathered. Faces she'd known for years looked at her with hatred. Women who'd shared her suffering spat at her. Men she'd once called neighbors raised fists and weapons. Someone yelled that they'd checked the graves, that 4 had been disturbed, that Martha Hendricks was missing. That Eleanor Pritchard was a ghoul, a cannibal, a demon in human form. Thomas Garrett stepped forward, appointed himself judge and jury. He demanded Eleanor confess. Tell them everything. Explain how many graves she'd robbed, how many bodies she'd defiled, how long she'd been feeding human flesh to her child. Eleanor looked past him to her cabin where May stood in the doorway. Small and lost and broken, Eleanor made her choice. She confessed to everything, said May knew nothing, that the child was innocent, that Eleanor had done it all alone, in secret, keeping her daughter ignorant. She begged them to spare May, to take the child in, care for her, give her a chance at a normal life despite the monster who'd raised her. The crowd didn't believe her. They wanted to punish May too, make the daughter pay for the mother's sins, but some of the women intervened. Sarah Mitchell, despite her earlier accusations, stepped forward and said the child was clearly traumatized, that May was as much a victim as anyone, that punishing an innocent child wouldn't bring back the dead or restore what Eleanor had taken. The crowd wavered, their bloodlust tempered slightly by the sight of May's tear-stained face and shaking body. Thomas made his decision. Eleanor would be executed tonight. No trial, no delay. She'd confessed. The evidence was undeniable. Justice would be swift. But May would be spared. She'd be taken in by one of the families, raised properly, kept away from her mother's legacy. Eleanor felt relief crash over her despite the death sentence. May would live. That was all that mattered. Everything else, the pain, the horror, the execution, was just details. They tied Eleanor's hands and led her to a tree at the edge of the settlement. Someone brought rope. Someone else fashioned a noose. The process was rushed, desperate, the community eager to purge itself of Eleanor's contamination. Eleanor didn't struggle. She looked back one final time and saw May collapsed in Sarah Mitchell's arms, the child's face buried against the woman's shoulder. Eleanor hoped May would forget, hoped time would dull the memories, hoped her daughter would find some kind of peace in a life Eleanor's love had nearly destroyed. They hanged Eleanor Pritchard as the sun set on March 7, 1881. The execution was crude and painful, the settlement having no experience with such things. Eleanor strangled slowly, her body convulsing, her face turning purple. The crowd watched in silence, their earlier rage transformed into something more complex. Horror at what they'd discovered, guilt over what they were doing, relief that the monster among them was being eliminated, and underneath it all the uncomfortable question of what they might have done in Eleanor's position, what lines they might have crossed if it meant saving their own children. May didn't watch. Sarah Mitchell took her inside, held her, while the child screamed and sobbed and tried to run to her mother. Other women helped, forming a protective circle around May, shielding her from the sight of Eleanor's death. They whispered comfort that meant nothing, said it would be all right, that May would recover, that this wasn't her fault. But May knew better. She knew that her survival had come at an unimaginable cost, that she was alive because her mother had become a monster, and that knowledge would shape everything that came after. Eleanor's body was left hanging through the night as a warning. In the morning, they cut her down and dragged her to the cemetery. They didn't bury her with the others. Instead, they dug a grave outside the consecrated ground, in the rocky area where they buried suicides and criminals. No marker, no prayer. Just dirt thrown over a body the community wanted to forget. The 4 graves Eleanor had disturbed were reopened, the remains examined and reburied properly. Martha Hendrick's body was never found. The settlement assumed Eleanor had disposed of it somehow, though no one looked too hard. Some knowledge is too terrible to pursue. May stayed with Sarah Mitchell for 3 weeks. The child barely spoke, barely ate. She spent hours staring at nothing, trapped in thoughts no one could reach. The other children avoided her. Adults whispered when she passed. Everyone knew what her mother had done. Everyone knew what May had eaten. The child was tainted by association, marked by horror, and despite Sarah's best efforts, the settlement couldn't accept her. May was a reminder of the winter's worst nightmare, a living embodiment of how far desperation could push human beings. In early April, as the snow finally began to melt for real, a traveling preacher came through Widow's Peak. He heard May's story and offered to take her with him when he left, to bring her to an orphanage in the valley where no one knew her history, where she could start fresh. Sarah agreed. It was the kindest thing she could do. May left the settlement without looking back, a small figure on a wagon disappearing down the mountain path, carrying secrets that would never fully leave her. The story of Eleanor Pritchard spread. Travelers carried it to other settlements. Newspapers picked it up, embellished it, turned it into a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the depths of human depravity. Most versions got the details wrong. Some claimed Eleanor had killed people, not just robbed graves. Others said she'd been practicing witchcraft, that May had been complicit. The truth was buried under layers of speculation and moral judgment, but the core remained. A mother's love transformed into monstrosity, a child saved through atrocity, a winter that revealed what humans become when survival strips away civilization. May grew up in the Valley Orphanage. She never spoke about Widow's Peak, never mentioned her mother, created an entirely new history for herself built on lies and omissions. She married young, had children of her own, lived a quiet life. But those who knew her well said she never seemed fully present, that something haunted her eyes, that she had nightmares she'd wake from screaming, and that she never ever ate meat. When asked why, she'd say she'd been sick as a child. That meat upset her stomach, another lie added to all the others. A small price to pay for the illusion of normalcy. Eleanor's grave remained unmarked. Over the years, the settlement of Widow's Peak was abandoned. The mine played out. The logging companies moved on. Families left for better opportunities. By 1900, the place was a ghost town. The cabins collapsed into themselves. The cemetery was reclaimed by forest. And Eleanor's story faded into legend. One more dark tale from the mountains where winter killed as surely as bullets or blades. But the question remains, the uncomfortable, unanswerable question that haunts this story. What would you do if you were starving, watching your child die slowly, painfully, inevitably? If you had the power to save them, but only through unthinkable means? If the choice was between becoming a monster or watching innocence fade from eyes you love more than life itself? What would you do? Eleanor Pritchard made her choice. She saved her daughter and damned herself. She crossed every moral boundary and embraced absolute horror. And in doing so, she revealed a truth we prefer not to acknowledge, that love isn't always beautiful, that survival isn't always noble, that sometimes being human means becoming something inhuman. Sometimes the starved child lives because the mother cannot, will not, bury what saves her, and we're left with this terrible knowledge that any of us, pushed far enough, broken down enough, desperate enough, might make the same choice, might feed our children horror and call it love, might sacrifice our souls for their survival. Eleanor Pritchard wasn't a monster, she was a mother, and maybe in the end, those two things aren't as different as we'd like to believe. The winter of 1881 ended, but the legacy of what happened in Widow's Peak, of what Eleanor did and what May survived, echoes still in the question that haunts every parent: how far would you go? And the answer, terrifying and true, is probably further than you think. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.